By 2019, Kilimall was no longer just an apartment story. It had millions of users, ambitions beyond Kenya, a China-facing supplier machine, and a founder who had already proved this could be much larger than a local online shop. In 2019, Yangtao officially transferred Kilimall's headquarters from Nairobi to Changsha, the capital of Hunan province in central China. The move aligned almost perfectly with the launch of the first China-Africa Economic and Trade Expo, or CAETE, held in Changsha in June 2019. It was a state-backed flagship event, co-sponsored by China's Ministry of Commerce and the Hunan provincial government, and positioned as a major mechanism under FOCAC. So Kilimall moved into a political and economic platform China was actively constructing for Africa-facing trade. And Xinhua's French language reporting, it directly suggests that the expo was the trigger. Yangtao recognized the opportunity and moved the headquarters to Changsha in 2019. So this was very strategic. Yangtao is from Hunan province. That sounds like a small biological point until you remember that Changsha is the capital of his home province. So this was also personal. If Kilimall wanted to be closer to Chinese suppliers, an obvious question is, why not just strengthen Shenzhen? Because Changsha offered something Shenzhen did not. Shenzhen, it was a market machine. Changsha was becoming a policy machine. By July 2018, Changsha had been included in the third batch of China's national comprehensive pilot zones for cross-border e-commerce. That comes with customs advantages, bonded warehouse support, policy access, and the kind of state attention that makes life easier for companies trying to move goods across borders at scale. By the early 2020s, Changsha was openly aiming to become China's third major cross-border e-commerce hub after Shenzhen and Hangzhou. So Yang was not moving Kilimall into a hometown comfort zone, he was moving it into a city deliberately building itself as a national node for cross-border trade. And the city had industrial depth behind the ambition. Around 1,800 electronic information enterprises, a national high-tech zone, tech incentives, and major industrial players like Lens Technology. Hunan's incentive structure for Africa-facing e-commerce is remarkably specific. Actual subsidies for overseas warehouses in Africa, reimbursement for self-built or leased warehouse costs, operating subsidies in the first 2 years, exhibition support, and Africa trade bonuses. If you're Kilimall and your model already revolves around warehouses in Africa, Chinese supply, and direct delivery into African markets, that support is not just decorative, it cuts directly into your core cost structure. And at that point, the question is not why move, it becomes why would a Chinese founder not move? At the 2019 Expo, Kilimall unveiled Kili.co, pitched as a bilateral e-commerce platform and an upgrade from the earlier one-directional Africa-facing model. So this shows that the move was not just administrative, it was about expanding the scale of the company's ambition. Before this, the main engine was Chinese goods moving into Africa consumer markets. Kili.co suggested something larger: Chinese goods into Africa and African products into China. Flowers, nuts, coffee, and so on, with delivery windows of 2 to 5 days. The stated ambition was huge. Nearly 500 million Chinese and African customers and 1 million enterprises in 5 years. Kilimall did not shut down Nairobi and vanish into a cloud of customs documents. The better way to understand it is as a split company model. China Daily's 2023 profile describes it clearly. Marketing, payment, distribution centers, and customer service, those stayed in Kenya, while operational and technology teams, they were based in Changsha. Africa-facing functions stayed in Africa. Higher value technical and strategic functions, those shifted to China. The app still looked very Kenyan to customers. The prices stayed in shillings, and the riders, they still arrived in Nairobi, not Changsha, to bring whatever discounted object people had bought that week. But the engineering, product development, supply chain management, and deeper operating logic moved increasingly to China. That's a very different thing from local control. Before 2019, Kilimall could still plausibly market itself as a Nairobi-born company with Chinese advantages. After 2019, it looked much more like a Chinese cross-border platform with African operations. By the time Kilimall partnered with Huawei Cloud in 2021, this was no longer a cute founder story about stock under the bed and one brave Bluetooth speaker carrying the company on its back. The company had already been through the apartment phase, the logistics phase, the supplier trust phase, the growth phase, and the Changsha move. So the Huawei Cloud deal, it was more of like a reunion, a practical fix. The partnership was announced publicly in November 2021 through Huawei Kenya and Huawei Cloud Materials. On the surface, the messaging was exactly what you would expect: digital transformation, efficiency, scalability, enhanced user experience, innovation, all the usual corporate language, assembled by a committee of people determined never to sound human. But the real issue was simpler. Huawei's own case study, it said that Kilimall services were developed in China and operated in Africa. So that sentence, it explains almost everything. If your engineering team is in Changsha, while your customers are in Nairobi, Kampala, and Lagos, distance becomes an infrastructure problem. Search has to feel immediate, checkout has to feel safe, and payment confirmation has to arrive fast enough that the customer does not think the app has swallowed the money and gone spiritually missing. For Kilimall, that mattered even more because the company had leaned so hard into online prepayment rather than default cash on delivery. Trust had to be earned before delivery, not after. So a slow platform was not just irritating, it was commercially dangerous. Technically, Kilimall had options: AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, Alibaba Cloud. Yang Tao used to work for Huawei. He came to Kenya in 2012 as a Huawei engineer tied to mobile payment infrastructure work around the M-Pesa ecosystem. CGTN's material is explicit that he and colleagues spent about 2 years establishing the mobile e-wallet infrastructure that later became part of the technical foundation for Kilimall's own online payment logic. So when Kilimall signs with Huawei Cloud in 2021, it's institutional gravity. A Huawei-trained founder, a company whose payment logic grew out of the Huawei adjacent experience, a platform already headquartered in Changsha, a business that had already sold Huawei hardware in Kenya. Then, Huawei Cloud becomes the infrastructure partner. The cloud partnership, it didn't come from nowhere. In April 2018, Huawei's Y7 Prime, it launched in Kenya and started selling exclusively on the Kilimall app. That already made Kilimall a distribution partner for Huawei's consumer hardware strategy in Kenya. And Huawei was not alone. Kilimall had already become an important launch channel for other Chinese smartphone brands too, including Gione, Tecno, and Infinix. So by the time the cloud deal appears, Huawei's role, it already has 2 layers: hardware on the shelf and infrastructure under the shelf. Huawei's case study also implies that Kilimall was already using a remarkably modern technical setup before the migration: Scrum workflows, containerized deployment, and architecture that needed orchestration at scale. By 2021, Kilimall had more than 10 million registered users, warehouse operations tied into the platform, promotional surges, and a China-built, Africa-operated model that made low-latency service increasingly hard to maintain without stronger cloud support. That's a real bottleneck. Managing containerized services, scaling during Black Friday, and keeping warehouse and order data in sync is technically impossible without serious cloud infrastructure. It's just fragile, engineering-heavy, and likely to go wrong at the worst possible time, which is exactly when customers decide you're fake. According to Huawei's published materials, the deal brought several concrete things. 1. Global data center deployment and CDN support aimed at reducing access delay in East Africa. 2. Kubernetes-based container management aligned with Kilimall's existing engineering workflow. 3. Elastic scaling during promotional traffic spikes. And 4. Distributed cache service to speed up product listings, search, and checkout. By 2025, Huawei was publicly claiming that the partnership had reduced latency to 60 milliseconds, improved response time by 80%, and increased data development efficiency 4-fold. When Kilimall launched in July 2014, it was not walking into an empty market waiting for a clever founder with a laptop and optimism. Jumia was already there. Jumia Kenya had launched in 2013, a full year earlier, and by early 2014, it already claimed nearly 100 employees and a 24,000 square foot warehouse in Westlands. So from day one, Kilimall was building in the shadow of a louder, better funded rival that had already planted its flag. One of the best things that happened to Kilimall was that Jumia got there first. Jumia had already done some of the expensive evangelism. It had already helped prove that Kenyan consumers would buy things online, that brands would take e-commerce seriously, and that online shopping was not just a niche pastime for overconfident people with data bundles. By 2014, Jumia was already celebrating rapid growth, including a 900% sales growth claim for Kenya in 2014, while signing up brands such as Bata, Nairobi Sports House, Amco, and Toy World. Jumia and Kilimall were built differently. Jumia looked like a classic rocket internet play. Heavy marketing, rapid scaling, a marketplace retail hybrid model, strong brand partnerships, and a Pan-African story about becoming the Amazon of Africa. Kilimall's model was different at the bone. Its edge was China, direct supplier relationships, an overseas warehouse model, a strong obsession with affordability, a tightly integrated stack of marketplace, payments, and logistics. I'm talking about Kilimall, LipaPay, and KiliExpress. So this was never just premium versus cheap. Jumia was strong on brand, visibility, and formal partnerships. Kilimall was stronger on direct China sourcing, price control, mobile money logic, and tighter vertical control from supplier to warehouse to rider. One of the smartest things Kilimall did was refuse to fight Jumia on exactly Jumia's terms. Jumia was already strong in Nairobi and already good at splashy campaigns and polished partnerships. So Young's strategy was not to out Jumia in image. That would have been a reckless hobby. Instead, Kilimall focused on what Jumia was structurally weaker at: price, China-side integration, mobile money-first architecture, last-mile control, and later, secondary cities beyond Nairobi. Young himself pointed to Nairobi as the biggest market for most e-commerce platforms, but he also looked beyond it. Jumia had funding, visibility, and major brand relationships. But Kilimall had something more dangerous in a price-sensitive market, a sourcing structure that allowed many products to be sold more cheaply. Jumia was not built as a deeply China-integrated supply chain platform. It relied more heavily on local distributors, partner brands, and broader retail channels. That brought credibility, but it also meant weaker pricing power on many Chinese-made goods, especially electronics and accessories. Kilimall could go closer to the factory, preposition inventory through the overseas warehouse model, and squeeze out more middlemen. And in Kenya, lower price is not some tiny bonus feature, it's an argument, sometimes the argument. Jumia operated across many African markets where cash on delivery had become a default habit. That came with all the familiar problems: failed deliveries, fraud, working capital strain, and reverse logistics. Kilimall came out of Young's M-Pesa experience. It built much more deeply around mobile money and later positioned itself as the first Chinese e-commerce platform in Africa to achieve full online payment. That gave it a tighter economic structure in a market where M-Pesa was trusted more than cards and certainly more than mysterious websites. Logistics also became a battlefield. Kilimall moved early into its own warehousing, delivery fleets, and integrated logistics through KiliExpress, while also adding partnerships with players such as Fargo, G4S, Posta Kenya, and Aramex. Even when Kilimall became a real force, the media story still favored Jumia. And that happened for understandable reasons. Jumia had the corporate theater. It raised big money, pushed a continental narrative, eventually listed publicly, and gave journalists a story they could package very easily. Kilimall grew more quietly. Its ownership structure was Chinese, much of its deeper story sat in Chinese language reporting, and it did not publish the same kind of investor-friendly metrics Jumia did. So journalists simply had more material and more access when writing about Jumia. There was also a persistent confusion between African leader and Kenyan leader. Continental visibility helped Jumia dominate the narrative, even when Kilimall was becoming much more significant inside Kenya than many people realized. By 2016, Kilimall was no longer thinking like a small Kenyan startup hoping to survive one more week. It had customers in the hundreds of thousands, then over 1 million in Kenya. Its Black Friday campaigns, they were hitting properly, and management clearly believed the model could travel. So, the company did what ambitious companies always do when things are going well. It got confident. Uganda came first in May 2016. Nigeria followed after trial runs during Black Friday, with Kilimall making it clear that this was part of a bigger continental ambition. And on paper, the logic looked solid enough. If Kilimall's edge in Kenya came from direct Chinese supply, lower prices, mobile money integration, and tighter control over logistics and payment, then why not repeat that in other African markets? The problem is that what worked in Kenya was not just a business model, it was a Kenya-specific business model, and that distinction came back to beat them. Uganda looked attractive for a very simple reason. E-commerce was still thin. From Kilimall's perspective, that probably looked like an opportunity. A relatively open field, fewer entrenched systems, a population of urban internet users, mobile money present, and room to become the early dominant player. But an underdeveloped market can mean two very different things. Sometimes it means untapped demand, and sometimes it means the supporting conditions are still missing. In Uganda, it was a lot of the second one. Internet use was growing, yes, but the vast internet use language in promotional material, it was clearly oversold. Uganda in 2016, it had a smaller online population, lower smartphone penetration than Kenya, weaker logistics, and a thinner e-commerce culture overall. So Kilimall was not entering a mini Kenya waiting politely to be discovered. It was entering a market where digital shopping habits, trust, and infrastructure were all less mature. Kilimall Uganda launched with the same broad thesis: affordable goods, strong electronics focus, a mix of global shopping and FBK fulfilled by Kilimall, local brand partnerships, mobile money integration, and heavy emphasis on trust messaging. The country team talked about working with local famous brands, integrating MTN mobile money and Airtel money, running campaigns with Bata, Huawei, and Infinix, and trying to build awareness among internet subscribers. So on the surface, yes, there was adaptation, but not deep adaptation. Uganda mostly got the Kenya template with local labels stuck on the side. Same broad category logic, same B2C structure, same promise of affordable quality, same imported goods engine, same belief that if you educate people, advertise enough, and smooth out payments, the market will eventually behave like Kenya. That was the bet. And then there was logistics. In Kenya, Kilimall survived because it built hard operational muscles: warehouse control, motorcycles, vehicles, courier partnerships, pickup logic, and eventually the KiliExpress ecosystem. In Uganda, the logistics model was weaker and more outsourced. The company relied on local courier partners for last-mile delivery, with no visible evidence of a Nairobi-style in-house fleet or a serious KiliExpress equivalent at comparable scale. That's a big deal, because in Kenya, Kilimall had learned that if the ecosystem is weak, you build more of it yourself. In Uganda, it seems to have tried the cheaper version. And the cheaper version broke. Now let's get it clear that Uganda did not fail because nobody ordered. Reporting in 2016 and 2017, it pointed to around 500 orders a day at one stage, and Black Friday 2016 reportedly brought more than 1,000 orders and 2,000 items sold within 24 hours. So this was not a ghost town. The problem was that early traction never turned into durable dominance. And the warning signs came quickly. By early 2017, Kilimall Uganda's own leadership was already speaking cautiously, saying they could not yet call the business successful. You know, founders and country managers, they don't usually downplay success unless the ground beneath them is already wobbling. Then came the deeper structural problems. Trust was weaker than in Kenya, and Uganda had no M-Pesa equivalent with the same scale, cultural familiarity, and embedded digital payment trust. Then, logistics were weaker, especially outside Kampala, and Kilimall did not build the same level of in-house control that it had built in Kenya. Consumer and business conservatism. They were repeatedly cited by both Kilimall and even Jumia voices in Uganda as a real brake on e-commerce growth. The total market was smaller, poorer, and less forgiving of friction such as delivery charges, delayed fulfillment, or payment hesitation. Competition was tougher than greenfield fantasies suggested because Jumia was already ahead, and cheaper China-linked players like Kiku could attack the same price-sensitive segment without carrying as much local operating cost. By late 2017, staff cuts had already started. Kilimall Uganda's managing director tried to downplay the scale publicly, but reports from people close to the situation described a much clearer pattern of decline, with layoffs, centralization of functions back to Kenya, and discussions about handing the operation to local buyers. By 2018, local fulfillment had largely collapsed. Digest Africa's reporting was blunt. If someone ordered from a Ugandan vendor on Kilimall, chances were high that they would not get the product. At that point, the site was still visible, but the local engine underneath, it was fading out. Nigeria was a different kind of mistake. Uganda was too thin, Nigeria was huge. And that size can be just as dangerous because it makes executives start speaking in continental destiny language before operations have caught up. Kilimall's Nigerian push appears to have followed successful Black Friday trial activity, after which the company officially launched and made it clear that it wanted to become a leader in African e-commerce. Again, this was confidence-driven, not desperation-driven. Kenya had not been exhausted. Kilimall was still growing there. It was still expanding beyond Nairobi, still adding brands, still building infrastructure. Nigeria happened because management thought the playbook was portable. And Nigeria is where that belief runs into a very rude fact. Nigeria is not Kenya with more people. It's a much larger, messier, more competitive, more fragmented market with brutal operational demands. But the deeper problem is that scale alone does not build control. And Kilimall's core strengths were all developed in the specific conditions of Kenya. M-Pesa culture, Nairobi-centered logistics learning, accumulated local trust, and years of adaptation in one East African market. Nigeria demanded a different machine, different payment behavior, different geography, different merchant dynamics, different competitive pressure, and probably much more local operational depth than Kilimall was realistically prepared to build at that stage. Kilimall is not just moving parcels, it's generating behavioral data at scale. Searches, abandoned carts, delivery locations, shopping patterns, merchant performance, payment-linked activity, returns, complaints, and repurchase cycles, all that. That information is commercially valuable. It reveals consumer demand, price sensitivity, urban buying behavior, seasonal patterns, and the rhythms of household commerce. Put very simply, Kilimall does not only sell into Kenya, it learns from Kenya. And the real question is who ultimately captures the value from that learning. If the platform's strategic brain, engineering team, and cloud stack all sit outside Kenya, then a large share of that learning power likely sits outside Kenya too. This is just Catalina, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next breakdown. I've attached my M-Pesa till number if you want to support the channel. It helps in editing. Bye!